Okay, so when I solved this problem, I started with 2 points. I called the left one D and the right one K for the two cities that we talked about, and I let the distance between the two cities be X. From here, I introduced a few variables just to get myself started. So I let T1 be the time it takes the first hiker to finish, V1 be the velocity of the first hiker, T2 be the time it takes the second hiker to finish, and V2 to be the velocity of the second hiker. I knew the equation that the velocity is distance divided by time, and if I multiply both sides by t, I would get TV equals d. From here, I came up with a few different equations. So I'm going to take this same idea of time times velocity equals the distance, just with the variables that I was introducing. So x is the distance between the two cities, equals t1 v1 for the first hiker. And because both hikers are going the same distance, this should be equal to t2 times v2. My second equation deals with the fact that they meet 3 hours into the travel. So 3 hours times v1 plus 3 hours times v2 should still equal the total distance between the two cities, because when the two hikers met up halfway through, if you add the two distances they've traveled, it needs to equal the total distance between the cities. And the third equation that I came up with dealt with the fact that the first hiker finishes 2.5 hours before the second hiker. So I knew T1 equaled T2 minus 2.5. So I ultimately used these three equations to try to find out the answer to the question of when the second hiker finishes. So I took the equation T2V2. The reason I picked this is it has T2 in it, which is what we're solving for. I knew this equaled X, but I know X also equals this equation. So we have 3v1 plus 3v2. From here, I tried to solve for T2, so I divided everything through by v2. So T2 equals 3 times the quantity v1 divided by v2 plus 3, and v2 divided by v2 would cancel out. From here, I had to figure out what to do with this v1 over v2, and to do that I came back up to this equation, because they both have v1 and v2 in them. So if I divide both sides by v2, we're going to end up with v1 over v2 on the left, and then I divided both sides by t1, so this equals t2 divided by t1, and so this substitution is going to come in down here. So we have T2 equals 3 times the quantity T2 divided by T1 plus 3. And so we're getting closer to what I wanted, which is an equation all in terms of T2. So the last substitution I need to make is T1, and I'm going to go back up to the third equation, which equals T2 minus 2.5. So we're going to end up with T2 equals 3 times T2 divided by T2 minus 2.5 plus 3. Now I have an equation all in terms of T2, which is exactly what I wanted, so all I need to do from here is solve for T2. So this is all going to be algebra from here on out. So the first thing I did was I wanted to multiply everything through by the T2 minus 2.5 in the denominator so that I didn't have any more fractions. So the left side is T2 times the quantity, T2 minus 2.5 equals 3T2, because when I multiply this by the denominator, they're going to cancel each other out, plus 3 times the quantity of T2 minus 2.5. So from here, I'm going to distribute the T2 in here, so we have T2 squared minus 2.5 T2. And since I now have this quadratic here, I'm going to try to make this whole thing equal 0, which means these pieces need to move over to the left-hand side. So I'm going to subtract the 3T2, subtract another 3T2 from here. And if I were to distribute this 3 in, 3 times negative 2.5 is negative 7.5, but to move it we're going to have to add it over, so plus 7.5. And now the right-hand side equals 0. And so this is going to become a quadratic that we're going to solve. So I next combine these like terms. So we have T2 squared. If you combine those like terms, you're going to get negative 8.5 T2 plus 7.5 equals 0. So, I'm just going to rewrite the equation over here. So we have t2 squared minus 8.5 t2 plus 7.5 equals 0. And so I'm just going to use the quadratic formula to solve this. So we're going to have 8.5 plus or minus the square root of negative 8.5 squared minus 4 times 1 times 7.5, all divided by 2 times 1. So we have 8.5 plus or minus, if you take the square root of this, you're going to get 6.5, all divided by 2. And this is what T2 equals. So from here, we're going to get two solutions, 1 and 7.5. So from here, we're really close to the end. I knew that the two hikers met 3 hours in, and so this first solution doesn't make sense because you can't have hiker 2 finishing in only 1 hour if they met 3 hours in. So you have to know that it took him 7.5 hours. So we knew that the hiker started at 10 o'clock, and if it takes the second hiker 7.5 hours to finish, it means that that hiker is going to end his journey at 5:30. So this is my solution.